The Apache war cry split the dawn air like a blade through silk. Martha Caldwell pressed her face against the stagecoach window, her wedding dress crumpled after 3 days of hard travel, as painted warriors on horseback thundered toward them. Across the desert floor, the driver's whip cracked desperately above her head, but she could see in his hunched shoulders that they wouldn't outrun death today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That's when she saw him, a lone figure on a ridge, motionless as carved stone, watching their desperate flight with the calculating eyes of a predator. Samuel Hartwell had tracked Apache war parties for the cavalry until Gettysburg took his left leg and his voice. Now he lived as a ghost in these badlands, avoiding civilization and the pity that came with it. But something about the woman's face in that coach window, pale and determined even in the face of death, made him reach for the rifle he'd sworn never to use again. In the next 10 minutes, a mail-order bride from Boston and a broken cavalry scout would forge a bond written in gunpowder and blood, one that would change the course of both their lives forever. Martha Elizabeth Caldwell had left Boston on a Tuesday morning in September 1867, carrying nothing but a carpet bag, her mother's wedding dress wrapped in tissue paper, and a single photograph of the man she was traveling 2,000 miles to marry. The photograph showed James Mitchell, a prosperous rancher from Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, standing beside a painted backdrop of mountains that looked nothing like the real desert she now found herself crossing. The correspondence had begun 6 months earlier, when her father, drowning in gambling debts, had answered Mitchell's advertisement in the Boston Herald. Established rancher seeks refined Eastern lady for matrimony. Must be of good character and willing to adapt to frontier life. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was that Mitchell had been dead for 3 weeks by the time Martha's train pulled out of Boston's South Station. Samuel Hartwell had discovered Mitchell's body while tracking a stolen horse, found him face down in Willow Creek with a Comanche arrow between his shoulder blades. The Apache hadn't killed Mitchell, wrong tribe, wrong arrows, but Samuel had kept that detail to himself when he buried the man beside his burned-out ranch house. In this country, the dead tell no tales, and the living rarely ask the right questions. The stagecoach carrying Martha had been running 2 days behind schedule when it finally reached the way station at Devil's Bend, where Samuel sometimes traded pelts for supplies. He'd been loading his pack mule when he overheard the station master talking to the driver about the mail-order bride bound for Mitchell's place. The station master, a leathery man named Pete Garrison, who'd lost an eye to a grizzly bear, was shaking his head with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd seen too many tragedies unfold. "Should have sent word ahead," Garrison muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Mitchell's been feeding the buzzards for near a month now. Girl's gonna find nothing but ashes and heartbreak when she gets there." Samuel had said nothing. He rarely spoke to anyone these days, but something cold had settled in his chest. He'd seen Mitchell's ranch house, or what was left of it after the fire, 3 rooms reduced to blackened timber and melted glass, with only the stone chimney standing, like a grave marker against the sky. The woman would arrive to find her intended husband dead, her new home destroyed, and herself stranded 1,000 miles from anything resembling civilization. The Apache had been raiding hard that summer, driven from their traditional hunting grounds by gold prospectors and cavalry patrols. War Chief Standing Bear had been leading his warriors in a series of lightning strikes against isolated settlements, hitting fast and disappearing into the maze of canyons that honeycombed the territory. The raids followed no pattern that the cavalry could predict, which made every mile of road between settlements a potential killing ground. Martha's stagecoach had picked up an escort of 4 soldiers at Fort Whitman, but Samuel knew those boys wouldn't be much help if Standing Bear's warriors decided to hit them. The soldiers were all fresh from back east, still soft around the edges, more familiar with parade drills than combat. Their lieutenant, a pink-cheeked boy named Morrison, who couldn't have been more than 22, had never seen an Apache warrior except in the illustrated magazines his mother sent from Philadelphia. The attack came at dawn on the third day, when the stagecoach was climbing toward Copper Ridge through a narrow pass called Devil's Throat. Samuel had been following the coach's dust trail from a distance, though he couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was simple curiosity about the woman who'd traveled so far to marry a dead man. Perhaps it was the memory of Mitchell's body, already, bloating in the creek when he'd found it. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something he didn't want to examine too closely. He was positioned on a rocky outcrop above the pass when the Apache struck. 12 warriors, painted for war, their ponies' hooves wrapped in leather to muffle sound. They came out of the rising sun like death itself, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls as they swept down on the lumbering stagecoach. The driver never had a chance. The first arrow took him high in the chest, spinning him backward off his seat. The horses, already spooked by the war cries, bolted forward into the narrow pass, the coach bouncing wildly behind them. Through his field glasses, Samuel could see the woman's white face pressed against the window, her eyes wide with terror, but her jaw set with determination. The 4 soldier escorts tried to form a defensive line, but Lieutenant Morrison panicked and gave contradictory orders. 2 of the soldiers wheeled their horses to charge the Apache. The other 2 tried to stay with the coach. The result was chaos. The Apache warriors, veterans of a dozen such fights, picked them apart with methodical precision. Morrison took a lance through the shoulder and tumbled from his horse, screaming. His men lasted perhaps 30 seconds longer. Samuel watched it all through his rifle scope, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of the Spencer repeating rifle he'd carried through the war. He'd told himself he was done with killing, done with the cavalry, done with everything that had cost him his leg and his peace of mind. But the woman's face in that coach window had stirred something in him that he'd thought was dead and buried with the rest of his past. The Apache had the coach surrounded now, their ponies dancing in tight circles as they closed the trap. The horses had tangled themselves in their traces, foam flecking their mouths as they reared and plunged in terror. Samuel could see Martha clearly now. She'd climbed through the coach's front window and was trying to untangle the reins with steady hands, even as arrows whistled past her head. That's when Standing Bear himself appeared, recognizable by the bear claw necklace that had given him his name and the repeating rifle he'd taken from a cavalry officer at Adobe Wells. The war. Chief was shouting orders to his warriors, directing them to take the woman alive. Samuel didn't need to understand Apache to know what that meant. A white woman would bring a good price from the Comancheros who traded in human misery along the Mexican border. Samuel had 3 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could stay hidden on his ridge, watch the Apache take the woman, and continue living as the ghost he'd become. Safe, solitary, owing nothing to anyone and expecting nothing in return. It would be the smart choice, the survivor's choice, the choice a man makes when he's seen enough death to last several lifetimes. Or he could pick up his rifle and remember who he used to be. Spencer kicked against his shoulder like a living thing as he squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the pass like thunder, and Standing Bear's lieutenant, a scarred warrior named Broken Wing, toppled from his pony with a .52 caliber bullet through his chest. The other Apache wheeled their horses in confusion, searching. For the source of the shot, Samuel was already moving, working the Spencer's lever action as he scrambled along the ridge. His wooden leg, carved from mountain ash and fitted with leather straps, made climbing treacherous, but he'd learned to compensate for its limitations during 3 years of hunting in these mountains. The Apache spotted his muzzle flash on the second shot, which dropped another warrior from his pony. But by then Samuel had shifted position again. Standing Bear was screaming orders now, splitting his remaining warriors between the coach and the ridge where Samuel had taken cover. It was exactly what Samuel had hoped for. Divide the enemy's attention, force them to fight on 2 fronts. basic cavalry tactics, though he'd never expected to use them again. Martha, meanwhile, had gotten the coach horses under control. She'd climbed fully onto the driver's seat now, her wedding dress torn and stained with dust and blood, the reins firm in her capable hands. Samuel could see her checking the road ahead, calculating distances and angles with the precision of someone who'd grown up around horses. She was planning something, and Samuel had a feeling it was going to be dangerous. The third shot from his Spencer took Standing Bear's horse in the chest, sending both rider and mount tumbling into the rocks. The war chief rolled clear, but his rifle went spinning away into a crevice where he couldn't reach it. That left 8 Apache warriors, and Samuel's ammunition wouldn't last forever. That's when Martha made her move. Instead of trying to flee down the pass, she turned the coach horses directly toward the Apache line, whipping them into a full gallop. The heavy stagecoach, built to withstand frontier roads, became a battering ram weighing nearly 2 tons. The Apache ponies, bred for speed and agility, scattered before its charge like leaves before a storm. Samuel used the confusion to close distance, sliding down the steep slope with his rifle ready. His wooden leg caught on a root and sent him tumbling the last 20 feet, but he managed to keep hold of his weapon. When he rolled to his feet at the bottom of the slope, he was close enough to see the whites of the Apache warrior's eyes. The fight that followed was close and brutal, the kind of combat that left no room for hesitation or mercy. Samuel's Spencer barked again and again, each shot carefully aimed, each bullet finding its mark. The Apache were skilled fighters, veterans of a dozen such encounters, but they were expecting to face frightened soldiers or helpless civilians. Samuel Hartwell was neither. He'd learned to fight with the 5th Cavalry Regiment during the war, serving as a scout and sharpshooter until a Confederate cannonball took his leg at Gettysburg. The injury had ended his military career, but it hadn't erased the skills that had kept him alive through 3 years of border warfare. He moved through the Apache warriors like death itself, his rifle speaking with mechanical precision. When the last warrior fell, Standing Bear was still alive, trapped beneath his dead horse with a broken leg and murder in his eyes. The war chief reached for the knife at his belt, but Samuel was already there, the muzzle of his Spencer pressed against the Apache's temple. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across a gulf of hatred and mutual respect. Standing Bear had been fighting to protect his people's way of life. Samuel had been fighting to protect a woman he'd never met. Both were soldiers, in their way, and both understood that war was a young man's game played by old men's rules. Samuel pulled the trigger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sudden silence that followed the gunshot was deafening. Martha had brought the coach to a stop 50 yards down the pass, and now she climbed down from the driver's seat with careful dignity, smoothing her torn skirts as if she were attending a church social instead of standing in the middle of a battlefield. She walked back towards Samuel with steady steps, and he found himself wondering what kind of woman traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger and then faced down Apache warriors without losing her composure. "Are you hurt?" she asked when she reached him, her voice carrying the crisp accent of educated Boston society. Samuel shook his head, suddenly aware that he hadn't spoken aloud to another human being in over 2 months. His throat felt rusty, his voice strange in his own ears when he finally managed to speak. "No, ma'am. You—" "Unharmed, thank you." She glanced around at the bodies scattered across the pass, her expression thoughtful rather than horrified. "I assume you're not Mr. Mitchell." Samuel's chest tightened. This was the moment he'd been dreading, though he hadn't realized it until now. "No, ma'am. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Mr. Mitchell." Martha studied his face for a long moment, and Samuel had the unsettling feeling that she could read more than he wanted to reveal. "He's dead, isn't he?" Yes, ma'am. I found his body about 3 weeks ago. Apache got him near his ranch. She nodded slowly as if this news confirmed something she'd already suspected. And his ranch? Burned out. Nothing left but the chimney. Martha was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the same calm composure she'd shown during the Apache attack. When she finally spoke, her voice held no trace of tears or self-pity. "Well then," she said, "I suppose that changes things considerably. The ride to Samuel's cabin took 4 hours through terrain that would have challenged an experienced frontiersman. Martha sat beside him on the wagon seat he'd fashioned from salvaged coach parts, her spine straight despite the jarring motion over rocks and dried creek beds. She hadn't complained once about abandoning the main road, though Samuel caught her, gripping the seat rail when they navigated particularly steep descents. His cabin sat in a hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow gap between two towering rock formations. The Apache called this place "where the eagles nest," though Samuel doubted they'd ever found his sanctuary. He'd chosen the location precisely because it was invisible from every direction until you were practically on top of it. A man could disappear here completely, which had been exactly what he'd wanted after the war. The cabin itself was modest but well built, constructed from pine logs he'd cut and hauled himself over the course of 2 summers. A stone chimney dominated one. Wall and small windows faced east and west to capture the best light. A covered porch ran along the front, where he'd often sat in the evenings, watching deer come down to drink from the spring that fed his small pond. Martha examined everything with the critical eye of someone accustomed to evaluating property. She noted the vegetable garden, neatly tended despite the late season, the small barn where his mule and the coach horses now rested, and the workshop where he crafted the wooden legs that had replaced his original prosthetic. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, stepping down from the wagon with practiced ease. "Had plenty of time," Samuel replied, unhitching the horses. The animals were exhausted from their ordeal, but otherwise unharmed. He'd need to care for them properly. Good horses were rare in this country, and these coach horses were better stock than most. Inside the cabin, Martha's trained domestic eye catalogued details that revealed more about Samuel's character than he might have intended. The floors were swept clean, dishes washed and stacked neatly on shelves he'd built himself. Books lined one wall, histories, technical manuals, and surprisingly, several volumes of poetry. A chess set sat on a small table near the window, the pieces arranged mid-game, as if he'd been playing against an invisible opponent. "You live alone," she observed, not making it a question. "For 3 years now." Samuel busied himself lighting the fire, grateful for the distraction. Having another person in his space felt strange after so long in solitude. Every sound she made, the rustle of her skirts, the soft tap of her boots on the wooden floor, seemed amplified in the silence he'd grown accustomed to. Martha explored the single bedroom with the practical efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick assessments. The bed was narrow but sturdy, built for one person. A trunk at its foot contained his few civilian clothes, all well maintained despite their age. Military discipline, she realized. This man had been a soldier long enough for certain habits to become permanent. "I'll sleep on the porch," Samuel said from the doorway, interpreting her survey as concern about propriety. "Weather still warm enough, and I often sleep outside anyway." "That won't be necessary." Martha turned to face him, her expression businesslike. "We're both adults, and these are unusual circumstances. I'm quite capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries without relegating you to outdoor sleeping on my account." Samuel wasn't sure how to respond to such directness. The women he'd known before the war, admittedly few, given his rural upbringing, had spoken in hints and implications, never addressing practical matters so bluntly. Martha Caldwell operated by different rules, ones he didn't fully understand yet. Evening brought new challenges. Samuel had grown accustomed to eating simple meals in solitude, usually whatever game he'd caught supplemented by vegetables from his garden. Tonight, he found himself attempting to prepare something suitable for a woman who'd traveled from Boston to marry a rancher. The results were adequate but hardly elegant: venison stew, cornbread, and coffee strong enough to float horseshoes. Martha ate without complaint, though he suspected she was comparing every bite to meals in Boston boarding houses or family dining rooms. She asked intelligent questions about the territory, the Apache situation, and the practical aspects of frontier life. Her questions revealed someone thinking seriously about long-term survival rather than making polite conversation. "The nearest settlement is Copper Ridge?" she asked, accepting a second cup of coffee. "Such as it is. Maybe 300 people, half of them miners. There's a general store, a saloon, and a boarding house that's seen better days. Father Rodriguez comes through once a month to hold services." "And the Apache?" Samuel considered his answer carefully. "Standing Bear's dead, but his tribe won't let that pass without response. They'll want revenge, and they'll blame any white person they can find. Travel between here and civilization is going to be dangerous for a while." Martha absorbed this information without visible distress. How long is a while? Could be weeks, could be months. Apache don't think about time the way we do. They'll strike when the moment feels right to them, not when it's convenient for us. After dinner, they sat on the porch as darkness settled over the valley. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried weight. Both understood that they were two strangers thrown together by circumstance, forced to make decisions that would affect the rest of their lives. "Tell me about James Mitchell," Samuel said eventually. Martha was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no particular emotion. "I never met him. The arrangement was made through correspondence, with my father handling most of the details. Mr. Mitchell seemed prosperous and respectable from his letters. He wrote well, demonstrated knowledge of literature and current events. He seemed suitable." "Suitable," Samuel repeated. "I'm 26 years old, Mr. Hartwell. In Boston society, that makes me quite firmly on the shelf. My father's financial difficulties made an advantageous marriage unlikely, and I lacked the temperament for genteel spinsterhood. Mr. Mitchell's proposal offered independence and purpose. The romantic aspects were secondary considerations." Samuel found her honesty refreshing after years of loneliness, but also unsettling. "And now?" "Now I find myself in a situation I hadn't anticipated. I have no money for return to Boston, assuming I could even reach the railroad safely. My father sold our house to pay gambling debts, so I have no home to return to regardless. I am, quite literally, stranded." The practical nature of her assessment impressed him. Many women in her situation would have dissolved into tears or hysteria. Martha faced her circumstances with the same calm composure she'd shown during the Apache attack. "There are options," Samuel said carefully. "The boarding house in Copper Ridge takes in women sometimes. Mrs. Patterson runs it. She's a decent woman, fair in her dealings. You could work there until you earned passage money." "What sort of work?" "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, maybe teaching if there are enough children. The pay isn't much, but Mrs. Patterson provides room and board." Martha considered this. "And you? What will you do?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on solving her problem that he hadn't considered how her presence had already changed his own situation. For 3 years, he'd lived as a hermit, avoiding human contact, content with his books and his solitude. But sitting here with her on his porch, watching stars emerge in the desert sky, he realized how much he'd missed simple human companionship. "I'll manage," he said, which wasn't really an answer. "That's not what I meant." Martha turned to study his profile in the starlight. "You saved my life today. You could have stayed hidden on that ridge and let the Apache take me. Instead, you chose to intervene, knowing it would put you in danger. Why? Samuel had been asking himself the same question all afternoon. The honest answer was that he didn't fully understand his own motivations. Something about her face in that coach window had stirred emotions he'd thought were permanently buried. But explaining that would require discussing parts of his past he preferred to leave alone. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. "Mr. Hartwell." Martha's voice carried a note of gentle reproof. "I may be stranded and dependent on your kindness, but I'm not naive. Men don't risk their lives for strangers without reason. What is it you're not telling me?" Samuel stood abruptly, his wooden legs scraping against the porch boards. "I should check on the horses before full dark. Apache sometimes try to steal stock at night." He was halfway to the barn before he realized Martha hadn't been fooled by his transparent excuse. She was still sitting on the porch when he returned 20 minutes later, her posture patient but expectant. Clearly she intended to wait for a real answer. "I had a wife once," he said without preamble, settling back into his chair. "Before the war. Her name was Elizabeth." Martha waited, sensing there was more. "She died while I was fighting in Virginia. Typhoid fever swept through our county in the winter of '63. By the time I got word and made it home on leave, she'd been in the ground 2 months. Samuel's voice remained steady, but Martha could hear the controlled pain beneath the words. "I went back to the war because there was nothing left for me at home. Got careless at Gettysburg, took a cannonball fragment that cost me my leg and my military career." "I'm sorry," Martha said quietly. "Elizabeth had the same color hair as you, same way of holding her chin when she was thinking. When I saw you, in that coach window for just a moment." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Martha understood. Grief made people see ghosts in unexpected places, made them act on impulses they couldn't entirely explain. Samuel's decision to intervene hadn't been entirely rational. It had been emotional, driven by memories and regrets he'd carried for years. She was fortunate to have someone who loved her so deeply, Martha said. "Was she? I wasn't there when she needed me most. I was off playing soldier while she died alone. You were serving your country. She would have understood that." Samuel made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. "You don't know that." "No," Martha agreed. "But I know. Something about duty and sacrifice. My father served in the Mexican War before his gambling problems destroyed him. There are costs to military service that civilians rarely understand. Your Elizabeth married a soldier. She knew what that meant." They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in private thoughts. The desert night was alive with sounds. Coyotes, calling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the soft nickering of horses in the barn. It was a peaceful symphony that Samuel had learned to appreciate during his years of solitude. Finally, Martha spoke again. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we figure out how to keep you alive until it's safe to travel. The Apache will be looking for revenge, and they know someone helped you escape. They'll search every ranch, every cabin, every hiding place they can find. Will they find us here?" Samuel considered the question seriously. "Not easily. This valley is hidden, and I've been careful to leave no obvious trails. But Standing Bear had been raiding for 20 years. He didn't survive that long by being careless. His warriors will be thorough in their search. So we wait, and we prepare. If they do find us, we'll need to be ready." Martha nodded, accepting this reality with the same composure she'd shown all day. "What can I do to help?" The question surprised him. Most women of her background would have expected to be protected and sheltered, while men handled the dangerous work. But Martha was asking how she could contribute to their mutual survival. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "My father taught me to hunt when I was young, before his problems became serious." I'm reasonably accurate with a rifle at moderate distances. Good. We'll start there. Can you cook over an open fire? I managed household staff in Boston, but I also know my way around a kitchen. I can adapt. Samuel found himself reassessing. Martha Caldwell once again. The woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach in her wedding dress bore little resemblance to the capable, practical person sitting beside him now. Adversity had a way of revealing people's true character, and Martha's character was proving to be considerably stronger than her refined appearance suggested. "There's something else," he said. "If the Apache find us, they'll try to take you alive. To them, you're valuable. They can trade you to the Comancheros for weapons and supplies. But if capture seems inevitable—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Martha understood. In Apache captivity, death might be preferable to what would come before it. "I understand," she said simply. They talked until late into the night, making plans and contingencies. Samuel shared his knowledge of Apache tactics, the geography of the surrounding territory, and the resources available to them. Martha proved to have a quick mind for strategy and an ability to think clearly under pressure that impressed him more with each passing hour. When they finally went inside, Samuel prepared to make good on his offer to sleep on the porch. But Martha stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Hartwell, Samuel." Her use of his first name felt intimate after the formality they'd maintained all day. "We may be facing danger together in the coming days. There's no need for us to maintain social conventions that serve no practical purpose. We're partners in survival now, whether we planned it or not." Samuel looked into her eyes and saw determination, intelligence, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Trust, perhaps, or simply the recognition that their circumstances had created a bond that transcended normal social boundaries. "Partners," he agreed. As Martha prepared for bed behind the privacy screen Samuel had hastily erected, he settled into his chair by the dying fire. Through the thin walls, he could hear the soft sounds of her evening routine, the whisper of fabric, the quiet splash of water in the wash basin, the creak of bed ropes as she settled for the night. For the first time in 3 years, Samuel Hartwell wasn't entirely alone. The feeling was both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. Dawn came with the sound of unshod hooves on stone. Samuel's eyes snapped open instantly, his hand reaching for the Colt revolver he kept beside his bed. 3 years of living alone in Apache country had taught him to distinguish between the normal sounds of morning wildlife and those that meant danger. These hooves moved too deliberately, with too much purpose, to belong to wild horses. Martha was already awake, sitting motionless on the edge of the bed with her boots in her hands. She'd heard it too. Their eyes met across the dim cabin, and Samuel held up 3 fingers, then pointed toward the window. 3 riders approaching from the east, where the gap in the rock formations provided the only access to the valley. Moving with practiced silence, Samuel eased himself out of bed and reached for his wooden leg. The leather straps had loosened during the night, and it took precious seconds to secure them properly. Martha had already pulled on her boots and was reaching for the rifle he'd given her the night before, a Winchester repeater he'd taken from one of the dead soldiers at Devil's Throat. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the natural entrance to the valley. Samuel pressed himself against the wall beside the east window, peering carefully through a gap in the wooden shutters. What he saw made his blood run cold. 3 Apache warriors sat their ponies at the valley's mouth, but these weren't random raiders. The leader was Grey Wolf, Standing Bear's younger brother, identifiable by the distinctive wolf pelt he wore across his shoulders. The other 2 were veteran fighters Samuel recognized from previous encounters, Broken Arrow and Nighthawk, both known for their skill at tracking and their ruthless efficiency in combat. Grey Wolf was studying the ground with the intense focus, of a man reading a story written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. The faint trail left by Samuel's wagon yesterday was still visible to trained eyes, despite his efforts to obscure it. The Apache leader raised his head and spoke quietly to his companions, pointing toward the cabin. Samuel felt Martha's presence beside him at the window. She'd moved across the room without making a sound, her rifle held ready. When she saw the three warriors, her breathing quickened slightly, but her hands remained steady on the weapon. "Grey Wolf," Samuel whispered, his lips barely moving. "Standing. Bear's brother. He's tracking us." Martha nodded, understanding the implications. These weren't random raiders who might be discouraged by a show of force. This was personal now, a matter of blood vengeance that would only end with death. The three Apache warriors dismounted and began advancing toward the cabin on foot, using the natural cover of rocks and scrub brush to mask their approach. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, covering ground quickly while remaining almost invisible. Samuel counted their weapons: rifles, knives, war clubs, and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged fight. "Back door," Samuel murmured, and Martha immediately understood. While they watched the eastern approach, one of the warriors might circle around to attack from behind. She moved to cover the cabin's rear exit, positioning herself where she could see both the back door and the small window that faced west. Grey Wolf had reached the edge of the clearing now, close enough that Samuel could see the paint on his face and the hatred burning in his dark eyes. The warrior raised his rifle and fired, the bullet smashing through the wooden shutters inches from Samuel's head. Splinters of pine wood scattered across the floor as Samuel dropped below the windowsill. The attack had begun. Samuel rolled away from the window as two more shots punched through the cabin walls. The Apache were using different positions now, creating a crossfire that would make it dangerous to show themselves at any opening. He could hear them calling to each other in their own language, coordinating their assault with the precision of experienced fighters. "Can you see the one at the back?" Samuel called to Martha, keeping his voice low. "Not yet, but there's movement in the rocks behind the barn." Samuel cursed silently. The barn held their horses, which represented their only means of escape if the cabin became untenable. If the Apache had reached that position, they were already cutting off potential retreat routes. A new sound reached his ears, the crackle of flames. Through the eastern window, he could see smoke rising from behind the cabin. The Apache had set fire to something, probably the small shed where he stored firewood and tools. They were trying to burn him out, or at least create enough smoke and confusion to mask their final assault. "We need to move," Samuel said, his mind racing through possibilities. The cabin's stone chimney and thick log walls would stop most rifle fire, but it wouldn't protect them from fire. And if the Apache were willing to wait, they could simply surround the cabin and starve them out. Martha had come to the same conclusion. "Where?" Samuel pointed toward the floor near the fireplace. "Root cellar. Built it as a storm shelter, but it's deep enough and well hidden. We can get there through the back room." They moved quickly but carefully, staying below the level of the windows as more shots peppered the cabin walls. Samuel had built the root cellar himself, excavating 8 feet down into the rocky soil and lining the walls with stone. The entrance was concealed beneath a heavy wooden cabinet that appeared to be built into the floor. Martha helped him shift the cabinet, revealing a narrow opening with wooden steps leading down into darkness. The space below was small but well supplied. Samuel had stocked it with water, preserved food, ammunition, and medical supplies. It was designed to keep 2 people alive for several days if necessary. "You first," Samuel said, but Martha shook her head. "You're injured. If they rush the cabin, you'll need those extra seconds to get down safely." Samuel started to argue, then realized she was right. His wooden leg made climbing awkward under the best circumstances, and the narrow steps would be treacherous if he had to descend quickly under fire. Martha disappeared into the opening with her rifle and a bag of ammunition. Samuel followed, pausing only to replace the cabinet over the entrance. If the Apache searched the cabin, they'd find evidence of recent habitation, but hopefully not the hidden cellar. The space below was cramped, but well ventilated through a carefully concealed air shaft. Martha had already found the oil lamp Samuel kept there, and its flickering light revealed their refuge, a rectangular chamber carved from living rock, with shelves lining the walls and a small cache of weapons in one corner. Above them, they could hear boots on the cabin floor. The Apache had breached the main door and was searching the rooms. Furniture crashed as they overturned tables and chairs, looking for hidden passages or valuables. One warrior called out something in Apache, and another answered from the bedroom. Samuel and Martha sat in tense silence, hardly daring to breathe. The root cellar was well hidden, but it wasn't invisible. If the Apache were thorough enough in their search, they'd eventually find the concealed entrance. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor directly above their heads. Samuel could hear the warriors talking to each other, their voices carrying clearly through the wooden planks. He didn't speak Apache fluently, but he understood enough to know they were discussing the cabin's construction, noting the quality of the workmanship and the evidence of long-term habitation. Something crashed in the front room, probably the chess table being overturned. Martha winced at the sound, and Samuel realized she was thinking about the books that lined his walls. To someone who valued learning and literature, the destruction of books would seem particularly senseless. The search continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, the sounds above them ceased. Samuel heard voices moving away from the cabin, growing fainter as the Apache withdrew to discuss their next move. "They know we were here recently," Samuel whispered. "Grey Wolf isn't stupid. He'll figure out we couldn't have gotten far on foot. Will they find the horses? Eventually, but my mule knows these mountains better than most people. If we can reach him," Martha understood. Samuel's pack mule was trained for mountain travel, sure-footed, enough to navigate terrain that would challenge even Apache ponies. If they could escape the immediate area, they'd have a chance of reaching safety. But first, they had to get out of the root cellar without being detected. Samuel had planned for this contingency when he'd built the shelter. The air shaft that provided ventilation also served as an emergency exit, though it was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The shaft angled upward for 12 feet before emerging behind a carefully positioned boulder 50 yards from the cabin. "Can you climb?" he asked Martha. She looked at the narrow opening dubiously. "I'll manage. What about your leg?" Samuel had been wondering the same thing. The wooden prosthetic was sturdy enough for walking and even running short distances, but climbing would be nearly impossible, and the shaft was too narrow to accommodate the device anyway. "I'll have to leave it behind," he said quietly. Martha stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. Without his wooden leg, Samuel would be severely handicapped. He could crawl and hop short distances, but anything more would be extremely difficult. "There has to be another way," she said. "There isn't, and every minute we wait gives them more time to search the area." Samuel was already unbuckling the leather straps that held his prosthetic in place. "You go first. Get to the barn and saddle the horses. I'll follow as best I can." "I'm not leaving you behind, Martha." Samuel's voice carried a note of command that reminded her he'd been a cavalry officer. "This isn't a debate. You can't help me climb, and I can't help you if we're both trapped down here." Martha looked like she wanted to argue further, but the sound of voices returning to the cabin above them ended the discussion. The Apache were back, and this time they sounded more determined. She squeezed into the narrow shaft without another word, using her elbows and knees to propel herself upward. Samuel could hear her breathing heavily as she navigated the tight space, but she made remarkably little noise for someone unaccustomed to such physical challenges. Above them, furniture crashed again as the warriors resumed their search. This time, They were being more systematic, testing floorboards and examining walls for hidden compartments. Samuel knew it was only a matter of time before they found the concealed entrance to the root cellar. Martha's boots disappeared from view as she reached the top of the shaft. Samuel waited 30 seconds, then began his own ascent. Without his wooden leg, he had to rely entirely on his arms and his good leg to pull himself up the narrow passage. The rough stone scraped against his back and shoulders as he inched upward, and more than once he had to pause to catch his breath. Halfway up, he heard a shout from the cabin below. One of the Apache had found the concealed entrance. There was a crash as they moved the cabinet aside, then rapid conversation as they discovered the root cellar. Samuel forced himself to climb faster, ignoring the pain in his shoulders and the burning in his lungs. Behind him, he could hear boots on the wooden steps as at least one warrior descended into the cellar. In seconds, they'd discover the air shaft and realize how their quarry had escaped. His hands reached the top of the shaft just as a voice echoed up from below, Grey Wolf shouting orders to his men. Samuel hauled himself out of the opening and rolled behind the concealing boulder, gasping for breath. Martha was waiting for him, her face pale with concern. She'd already retrieved his crutches from the cabin, improvised walking aids he'd carved from sturdy branches years ago, but rarely used. Now she helped him get them positioned under his arms. "The horses?" Samuel asked. "Saddled and ready." "But Samuel, there are more of them. I counted at least 6 warriors around the barn." Samuel's heart sank. Grey Wolf had brought more men than he'd initially seen, keeping some in reserve while the first 3 searched the cabin. Now they were closing the trap, surrounding the entire valley to prevent escape. "We need a diversion," he said, his mind racing through possibilities. What kind of diversion? Samuel looked back toward his cabin, where smoke was still rising from the burning shed. The Apache would expect them to try for the horses. It was the logical escape route. But what if they did something unexpected instead? "The explosives," he said suddenly. "What explosives?" "In the root cellar. I kept a small cache of dynamite for clearing tree stumps." Samuel's eyes were bright with possibility. "If we can get back down there, they'll be watching the cabin now. Not if they think we've already escaped. Martha, I need you to create a distraction at the far end of the valley. Make enough noise to draw them away from the cabin. Can you do that?" Martha looked skeptical, but she nodded. "How long do you need?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. She studied his face, reading the determination there. "This is dangerous, Samuel. If you're caught in that cellar, I won't be. But if this works, it'll give us the advantage we need to escape." Martha squeezed his shoulder, a gesture of support and farewell. Then she was gone, moving with surprising stealth toward the eastern end of the valley where the Apache ponies were picketed. Samuel waited until he heard shouting from that direction. Martha had done something to spook the horses, and the Apache were responding. He could see several warriors running toward the disturbance, leaving the cabin area less heavily guarded. Moving as quickly as his crutches would allow, Samuel made his way back to the cabin. The Apache had left one guard, but the warrior was looking toward the commotion at the other end of the valley. Samuel approached from his blind side, using a knife to end the threat, quickly and silently. Getting back into the root cellar was easier than climbing out. Samuel dropped through the opening and immediately located his cache of explosives, 6 sticks of dynamite wrapped in oiled cloth, along with fuses and blasting caps. Not enough to level a mountain, but more than sufficient for what he had in mind. The plan was simple but dangerous. He would plant the explosives at strategic points around the valley's entrance, then detonate them to collapse part of the rock formation. The resulting rock slide would trap the Apache in the valley long enough for him and Martha to escape, but the timing had to be perfect, too early, and the Apache would have time to find another way out. Too late, and he and Martha would be trapped. With them, Samuel worked quickly, his hands steady despite the circumstances. He'd handled explosives during the war, demolishing bridges and Confederate supply depots. The principles were the same, even if the stakes felt higher now. By the time he finished setting the charges, the commotion at the other end of the valley was dying down. Martha had done her job. The Apache were regrouping, but they'd wasted precious time chasing shadows. Now they'd be even more determined to find their quarry. Samuel lit the fuses and began the longest 100-yard crawl of his life. The explosion shattered the morning silence like the wrath of God himself. 6 sticks of dynamite detonated simultaneously at the base of the eastern rock formation, sending thousands of tons of stone cascading down to seal the valley's only entrance. The ground shook beneath Samuel as he pressed himself flat against a boulder, debris raining down around him like deadly hail. Through the dust and smoke, he could hear Apache voices raised in alarm and confusion. Grey Wolf was shouting orders, but his warriors were scattered across the valley, some trapped on the wrong side of the rockslide, others cut off from their ponies by the avalanche Samuel had triggered. Martha appeared through the settling dust, leading 2 saddled horses and looking remarkably composed for someone who'd just survived an explosion. She'd somehow managed to circle back to the barn during the chaos, retrieving not only their mounts, but also Samuel's pack mule and several bags of supplies. "Can you ride?" she asked, helping him to his feet. Samuel tested his balance against the horse's stirrup. Without his wooden leg, mounting would be awkward, but not impossible. "I'll manage." The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the valley walls as Apache warriors converged on their position. Grey Wolf had regrouped faster than Samuel had hoped, and now the remaining warriors were closing in from multiple directions. The explosion had bought them time, but not nearly enough. Samuel hauled himself into the saddle, his good leg finding the stirrup while Martha adjusted the other side to accommodate his missing limb. She mounted her own horse with fluid grace, the Winchester rifle across her saddle horn, ready for action. "Which way?" she asked. Samuel pointed toward what looked like an impossible wall of rock at the valley's western end. "There's a trail up through those cliffs, barely wide enough for one horse, but it leads to the high country. If we can reach it—" They spurred their horses toward the cliff face as the first Apache warriors rounded the barn behind them. Samuel's mount was a sturdy bay gelding he'd trained himself, sure-footed and responsive to leg pressure. Martha rode one of the coach horses, a mare with more speed than mountain experience, but enough sense to follow where the other horses led. The trail Samuel had mentioned was nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. A narrow ledge that switched back and forth up the cliff face, carved by countless years of wind and water erosion. Mountain sheep had widened it over generations, but it had never been intended for horses carrying riders fleeing for their lives. Behind them, rifle shots cracked across the valley as Grey Wolf's warriors opened fire. Most of the bullets went wide. Shooting uphill at moving targets was difficult under the best circumstances, but Samuel felt one slug whistle past his ear, close enough to part his hair. The trail's first switchback was barely 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop of 50 feet on one side and solid rock on the other. Samuel's gelding negotiated it with the calm confidence of an animal that trusted its rider completely. Martha's mare was more skittish, dancing sideways and rolling her eyes at the exposure, but Martha's firm hands and quiet voice kept the animal moving forward. Halfway up the cliff, Samuel risked a look back into the valley. Grey Wolf had reached the base of the trail with 3 of his warriors, but their ponies were refusing to attempt the narrow ledge. Apache horses were bred for speed and endurance on open ground, not for mountain climbing. The warriors would have to continue on foot, which would slow them considerably, but not stop them entirely. The higher they climbed, the more treacherous the trail became. In places, erosion had washed away sections of the ledge, leaving gaps that had to be jumped. Samuel's gelding cleared these obstacles with room to spare, but Martha's mare balked at the first gap, snorting and backing away from what looked like certain death. "Trust her," Samuel called back. "Let her find her own way across." Martha loosened the reins, allowing the mare to approach the gap at her own pace. The horse studied the obstacle for several tense seconds, then gathered herself and leaped across, in one smooth motion. Martha's face was pale, but determined when they landed safely on the other side. The sound of boots on stone echoed up from below. Grey Wolf and his warriors were climbing the trail on foot, making better time than Samuel had hoped. Without the burden of horses, they could move faster and take risks that mounted riders couldn't afford. "How much farther?" Martha asked during a brief rest on a wider section of ledge. "Another 100 yards to the top, then we'll have options." What Samuel didn't mention was that those options were all dangerous. The high country beyond the cliff offered multiple escape routes, but it was also Apache territory, a maze of canyons and mesas where Grey Wolf's warriors knew every hiding place and water source. Their only advantage would be Samuel's pack, mule, which could navigate terrain that would challenge even Apache ponies. They reached the top of the cliff just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, flooding the landscape below with golden light. The view was spectacular, endless miles of desert and mountains stretching to the horizon, painted in shades of red and gold that took Martha's breath away. Under different circumstances, she might have paused to appreciate the beauty. Today, survival took precedence over scenery. Samuel led them away from the cliff edge toward a landscape that looked like something from another world. Wind and water had carved the sandstone into fantastic shapes, arches and spires, slot canyons so narrow a horse could barely squeeze through, and hidden valleys where ancient peoples had left their mark on cave walls. The pack mule proved its worth almost immediately, picking its way through obstacles that would have stopped ordinary horses. Samuel had chosen the animal specifically for mountain travel, and its ability to navigate rough terrain was legendary among the few people who knew of Samuel's existence. Behind them, Grey Wolf's voice echoed off the rocks as he reached the top of the cliff. The Apache war leader was calling to his scattered warriors, trying to coordinate their pursuit across terrain that favored the hunted over the hunters. But Samuel knew that advantage wouldn't last long. The Apache were the finest trackers in the world, capable of following a trail across solid rock where most men would see nothing but empty stone. They rode for 2 hours through a landscape that seemed designed to swallow travelers without a trace. Martha began to understand why the Apache had dominated this territory for generations. It was a fortress built by nature itself, full of hiding places and natural defenses that could shelter an army or conceal a single fugitive. Samuel called. A halt beside a hidden spring where ancient petroglyphs decorated the rock walls. The horses needed water and rest, and Martha needed a few minutes to recover from the morning's ordeal. She dismounted stiffly, her legs shaking from the strain of riding unfamiliar terrain while fighting exhaustion and terror. "How do you know about this place?" she asked, kneeling beside the spring to splash cool water on her face. "Found it 3 years ago while tracking a wounded elk. Been using it as a way station ever since." Samuel was studying their back trail, looking for signs of pursuit. "The Apache know about it too, but they consider it neutral ground. Water sources are sacred in this country." Martha looked around at the petroglyphs, stick figures of men and animals, handprints pressed into the rock by people who'd lived and died centuries ago. The images told stories of hunts and battles, of seasons and ceremonies, of a way of life that had persisted in this harsh landscape for thousands of years. "Will they respect that neutrality now?" she asked. Samuel's expression was grim. "Grey Wolf's brother is dead. In Apache culture, that creates a blood debt that can only be paid with blood. He'll follow us into hell itself, if necessary." As if summoned by his words, a war cry echoed across the canyon, closer than Samuel had expected. Grey Wolf had split his warriors into multiple groups, sending them along different routes to cut off potential escape paths. The Apache leader was proving to be as skilled a tactician as his dead brother. They mounted quickly and pushed deeper into the maze of canyons, following trails that seemed to lead nowhere, but somehow always provided a way forward. Samuel's knowledge of the terrain was their only advantage now. He knew which passages were dead ends, which narrow slots could trap unwary riders, and which hidden paths led to safety. The chase continued through the hottest part of the day, a deadly game of cat and mouse played across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Martha learned to read the landscape through Samuel's eyes, understanding which formations offered concealment and which ones were potential traps. They were following a narrow wash between towering canyon walls when Samuel suddenly raised his hand for silence. Ahead, the canyon widened into a circular amphitheater where several passages converged. It was exactly the kind of place where an ambush could be waiting. Samuel dismounted and crept forward on foot, using his crutches to navigate the rocky ground as quietly as possible. Martha held the horses, her rifle ready, watching the canyon walls for any sign of movement. The amphitheater appeared empty, but Samuel's instincts were screaming warnings. Something was wrong. The silence was too complete, the shadows too deep. He was backing away when the first arrow whistled past his head, striking sparks from the rock wall behind him. Grey Wolf and two warriors rose from concealment like phantoms, their war paint making them nearly invisible against the canyon walls. They'd anticipated Samuel's route and positioned themselves perfectly for an ambush. The Apache leader's eyes burned with hatred as he knocked another arrow to his bowstring. Samuel dove behind a boulder as the second arrow shattered against the stone where he'd been standing. His rifle was still with the horses, 20 yards away across open ground that might as well have been 20 miles. The Apache had him pinned down with no way to reach better cover. That's when Martha proved once again that she was far more than a refined Boston lady looking for a suitable marriage. Instead of staying safely back with the horses, she worked her way along the canyon wall, using every bit of cover available. Her Winchester spoke twice in rapid succession, and one of Grey Wolf's warriors spun away from the rocks, clutching a shattered shoulder. The distraction gave Samuel the seconds he needed to reach his rifle. He rolled across the open ground and came up firing, his Spencer barking defiance at the Apache positions. Grey Wolf ducked back behind cover, but not before Samuel's bullet clipped the eagle feather from his hair. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Grey Wolf and his remaining warrior had the advantage of position, but Samuel and Martha had superior firepower and the discipline that came from fighting as a team. Martha's shooting was accurate and steady, forcing the Apache to keep their heads down while Samuel maneuvered for better angles. The end came suddenly. Grey Wolf made the mistake of exposing himself for one clear shot at Martha, and Samuel was ready for him. Spencer's heavy bullet took the Apache war leader high in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him among the rocks where he'd made his stand. The surviving warrior, faced with impossible odds, melted away into the canyon shadows like smoke. Samuel knew better than to pursue. In this terrain, a single Apache warrior could hold off a dozen enemies or disappear completely, depending on his intentions. Grey Wolf was still alive when Samuel reached him, blood frothing on his lips as he struggled to speak. The Apache leader's eyes held no fear, only the calm acceptance of a warrior who'd lived by violence and expected to die the same way. "You fight like Apache," Grey Wolf whispered in broken English. "My brother chose his death well." Samuel knelt beside the dying man, offering him water from his canteen. It was a gesture of respect between warriors, recognizing courage even in an enemy. "Your brother died bravely," Samuel replied. "He protected his people as you protected yours." Grey Wolf smiled, blood staining his teeth. "The woman, she is a warrior too. You are fortunate." Those were his last words. Samuel closed the dead man's eyes and began the task of moving rocks to build a cairn. In this country, every death deserved recognition, even that of an enemy. Martha stood guard while Samuel worked, her rifle ready for any sign of the remaining Apache warrior. But the canyon remained silent, except for the whisper of wind through stone arches and the distant cry of hawks circling high overhead. When the burial was complete, they rode out of the amphitheater in silence, each lost in private thoughts about the violence they'd witnessed and participated in. The chase was over, but neither of them felt like celebrating. Too many people had died for causes that seemed smaller in the aftermath than they had in the heat of conflict. The trail led upward, now climbing toward passes that would take them over the mountains and down into the country where they could find civilization and safety. Behind them, the maze of canyons held its secrets close, hiding the graves of warriors who'd fought and died for the right to call this harsh landscape home. Martha rode beside Samuel in companionable silence, both of them understanding that they'd shared something that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. They'd faced death as partners and emerged stronger for the experience. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The mining town of Silver Creek clung to the mountainside, like a collection of children's blocks scattered by a careless hand. Martha counted maybe 40 buildings as they descended the winding trail, most of them weathered wood and corrugated tin that had seen better decades. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the distant sound of machinery echoed from the mine shafts carved into the hillside above the town. After 5 days in the wilderness, even this rough settlement looked like paradise. Martha's wedding dress had been reduced to tatters, replaced by practical clothing Samuel had fashioned from spare blankets and leather. Her hair, once carefully styled for her wedding to a dead man, now hung in a simple braid down her back. The transformation from Boston lady to frontier woman was nearly complete. Samuel guided his horse down the main street with the easy confidence of someone who'd visited Silver Creek before. The town existed solely to extract silver from the mountain's belly, and like most mining camps, it attracted a rough crowd of prospectors, gamblers, and merchants who asked few questions about a person's past. Martha noticed how people watched. Them, a woman riding beside a man with a wooden leg, both of them armed and showing signs of hard travel. Conversations stopped as they passed, and more than one miner emerged from saloons to get a better look at the strangers. "Is there a hotel?" Martha asked, suddenly conscious of her appearance and the curious stares. "Mrs. Brennan runs a boarding, out at the end of the street. Clean beds, decent food, and she minds her own business." Samuel's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd pushed himself to his limits over the past week. "We can rest there while we figure out what comes next." What comes next? The phrase hung between them like a question neither was ready to answer. During their flight from the Apache, survival had been their only concern. Now, faced with the prospect of civilization and choices, the future suddenly seemed complicated again. Mrs. Brennan turned out to be a formidable Irish woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Martha and Samuel and ushered them inside without asking uncomfortable questions. The boarding house was simple but scrupulously clean, with 6 small rooms upstairs and a dining room that doubled as the town's unofficial meeting place. "You'll be wanting baths and hot meals," Mrs. Brennan announced, leading them up the narrow stairs. "And, from the looks of you, a good night's sleep in actual beds. I've got 2 rooms available, adjoining if that suits your arrangements." Samuel started to explain that they weren't married, but Martha cut him off with a gentle touch on his arm. "That will be perfect, Mrs. Brennan. Thank you." The Irishwoman's knowing smile suggested she'd hosted many couples whose legal status was ambiguous. In mining towns, people made their own rules about relationships and respectability. Martha's room was small but comfortable, with a real mattress, clean sheets, and a wash basin with hot water that Mrs. Brennan had provided. She stood at the single window, looking out at the bustling street below, and tried to process everything that had happened since she'd stepped off that stagecoach a week ago. She'd travelled west to marry a stranger and found herself partnered with a man who'd saved her life multiple times. She'd faced Apache warriors, survived explosions and gunfights, and discovered reserves of courage and capability she'd never known she possessed. The woman who'd left Boston seemed like a different person entirely. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Samuel stood in the doorway between their rooms, freshly washed and wearing clean clothes he'd purchased from the general store. Without his trail dust and the grim expression of someone expecting attack at any moment, he looked younger and more approachable. "Mrs. Brennan says dinner will be ready in an hour," he said. "Figured you might want time to rest before we talk." "About things," Martha nodded, grateful for his consideration. They'd been through too much together to make important decisions while exhausted and emotionally drained. The dining room filled with miners and merchants as evening fell. Martha had changed into the one decent dress she'd managed to salvage from her belongings, and she felt the weight of masculine attention as she descended the stairs. In a town where women were scarce, her presence created a stir that made Samuel unconsciously move closer to her side. Dinner was simple but substantial. Beef, stew, fresh bread and vegetables from Mrs. Brennan's garden. Martha realized she hadn't eaten a proper meal since leaving Samuel's cabin, and the hot food tasted better than anything she'd ever been served in Boston's finest restaurants. The conversation at neighboring tables provided an education in frontier economics. Silver prices were falling, making some claims unprofitable. The railroad was considering extending a spur line to Silver Creek, which would either bring prosperity or competition that would kill the town. A territorial governor was promising statehood within 5 years, along with law and order that many residents seemed to view with suspicion. "Not much like Boston," Samuel observed quietly. "No," Martha agreed. "It's not." She paused, considering her words carefully. "But I'm discovering that I may not be as much like Boston as I thought." After dinner, they walked through the town's single street as the sun set behind the western peaks. Silver Creek came alive at night, with saloons providing music and laughter, and the mine's night shift heading up the mountain with lanterns bobbing like fireflies. "There's a stage that comes through twice a week," Samuel said eventually. "Connects to the railroad at Junction City. You could be back in Boston within 2 weeks if that's what you want." Martha stopped walking and turned to face him. "Is that what you think I should do?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight spilling from a nearby saloon. "I think you should do whatever makes you happy. You've got more courage and capability than most men I've known. You'll succeed at whatever you choose." "That's not what I asked." Samuel knew it wasn't. She was asking what he wanted, what he hoped for, what kind of future he could imagine for them together. It was a fair question, but one he'd been avoiding since they'd reached safety. "I'm not James Mitchell," he said finally. "I can't offer you a ranch or prosperity or the kind of life you came west to find. I've got a cabin in the mountains, some skills that keep me fed and not much else. I'm also 15 years older than you, missing a leg, and about as far from Boston society as a man can get." Martha listened to this recitation of his perceived shortcomings with growing impatience. "Are you finished cataloguing your deficiencies?" "I'm trying to be honest about what I can offer. Then let me be equally honest about what I'm looking for." Martha's voice carried the crisp authority she'd inherited from generations of New England ancestors. "I didn't come west for romance or adventure. I came because I needed independence and purpose. James Mitchell represented security and a role I could fill competently. I was prepared to be a suitable wife to a suitable man in a suitable arrangement." Samuel waited, sensing there was more. But this past week has shown me something I didn't know about myself. I'm not meant to be merely suitable. I'm capable of more than managing a household and hosting dinner parties. I can think clearly under pressure, handle weapons effectively, and make decisions that keep people alive. I've discovered that I'm actually quite good at being a partner, rather than just a dependent. Martha, I'm not finished. Her tone brooked no interruption. You say you can't offer me what James Mitchell promised. Thank God for that. James Mitchell was offering me a cage, albeit a comfortable one. You've shown me what it means to be truly needed, to contribute something valuable, to face challenges as an equal, rather than someone to be protected and sheltered. Samuel stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. So let me ask you a question, Samuel Hartwell. Are you offering me a partnership? Because if you are, I'm interested in hearing the terms. A partnership. Samuel had never thought of marriage in those terms, but it made perfect sense. Elizabeth had been his wife in the traditional sense, someone he'd loved and protected and provided for. But Martha was different. She'd proven herself his equal under circumstances that would have broken many people. The terms would be unconventional, he said slowly. No guarantees of comfort or safety, no servants or social position, just two people building something together in a country that doesn't forgive mistakes. I'm listening. I know these mountains better than most white men. There are opportunities here for people willing to work hard and take risks. Not just mining, ranching, trading, maybe guiding settlers who want to homestead in the valleys. The territory's changing fast. There's room for people who can adapt and grow with it. Martha's eyes brightened with interest. This was the kind of challenge she'd never known she wanted. There's a valley about 30 miles north of here, Samuel continued, warming to his theme. Good water, protected from the worst weather, close enough to establish trails for trading, but far enough from settlements for privacy. Land office says it's available for homesteading. A man and woman could build something substantial there. What? About the Apache? Grey Wolf was the last of the old war leaders in this region. Without him, the remaining bands will probably accept reservation life rather than continue fighting. There'll always be some risk, but no more than any other frontier settlement faces. Martha was quiet for several minutes, processing what he'd proposed. It was hardly the life she'd imagined when she'd left Boston, but it offered something far more valuable than security. The chance to help create something entirely new. There's one more thing we should discuss, she said finally. Samuel waited. I'm not Elizabeth. The statement hung between them, acknowledging the ghost that had haunted their relationship from the beginning. Samuel had saved Martha partly because she'd reminded him of his dead wife, but they'd both learned that resemblance was superficial. No, Samuel agreed. You're not. Elizabeth was gentle and domestic, happiest when she was tending her garden or sewing by the fire. She needed protection and found fulfillment in traditional roles. You're something entirely different. Does that disappoint you? Samuel considered the question seriously. At first, maybe. I thought I wanted to recreate what I'd lost. But Elizabeth belonged to a different time in my life when I was a different man. What we had was perfect for who we were then, but it wouldn't work for who I am now. And who are you now? Someone who's learned that the best partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared challenges. Someone who's discovered that protection isn't the same as partnership, and that the right woman doesn't need saving. She needs someone to stand beside her while she saves herself. Martha smiled, the first truly relaxed expression Samuel had seen on her face since they'd met. That sounds like the beginning of acceptable terms. They walked back toward the boarding house in comfortable silence, both understanding that they'd crossed an important threshold. Tomorrow would bring practical decisions about supplies, travel, and the dozens of details involved in starting a new life. But tonight, they'd established the foundation for something that could last. Mrs. Brennan was waiting in the parlor when they returned, darning socks by lamplight. The Irish woman looked up as they entered, her experienced eyes reading the subtle changes in their posture and expressions. "I'll be posting a letter to the Territorial Land Office tomorrow," she announced without preamble. "Wouldn't want that valley property to go to someone else while you're making up your minds." Samuel stared at her. "How did you—" "I've been listening to frontier couples sort out their futures for 20 years, Mr. Hartwell. You two have the look of people who've found what they're searching for. Besides, that valley you mentioned has been waiting for the right people. High time someone with sense claimed it." Martha laughed, delighted by the older woman's assumption and efficiency. "You're very confident in your assessment, Mrs. Brennan. Child, I've watched this whole territory grow from nothing to something. I can spot the people who'll succeed and the ones who'll wash out after the first hard winter. You two are builders. This country needs builders." As they climbed the stairs to their rooms, Martha felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced since childhood. For the first time in years, the future seemed full of possibilities rather than limitations. She was about to become a homesteader, a partner in building something new, a woman whose worth would be measured by her contributions rather than her compliance. At the top of the stairs, Samuel paused outside her door. "Martha, about tomorrow. We should probably discuss the practical arrangements. If we're going to file a homestead claim, there are certain legal requirements." "Are you asking me to marry you, Samuel Hartwell?" The directness of the question caught him off guard, but he recovered quickly. "I'm asking if you'd consider a legal partnership that would allow us to file joint claims and build something together. The romantic aspects, well, I figure we can let those develop naturally." Martha considered this proposal with the same careful attention she'd given all the major decisions of the past week. A marriage of practical partnership, with room for deeper feelings to grow if they chose. It was exactly the kind of unconventional arrangement that would have scandalized Boston society and perfectly suited her current situation. "I think," she said slowly, "that sounds like an excellent foundation for a successful partnership." Samuel's relief was visible. "So that's a yes?" "That's a yes to the partnership. As for the rest—" She smiled and disappeared into her room, leaving him standing in the hallway with the distinct impression that Martha Caldwell was going to keep him guessing for years to come. The wedding took place 3 days later in Silver Creek's tiny church, a building that served double duty as schoolhouse and community meeting hall. Father Miguel, a circuit priest who'd arrived on the morning stage, performed the ceremony with the practical efficiency of a man who'd married dozens of frontier couples under similar circumstances. Martha wore a simple blue dress purchased from the general store, her only concession to bridal tradition being the small bouquet of wildflowers Mrs. Brennan had gathered from the mountainside. Samuel stood beside her in his best shirt and jacket, his wooden leg hidden beneath carefully tailored trousers that concealed more than they revealed. The witnesses were an eclectic mix of Silver Creek's residents, miners who'd known Samuel from previous visits, merchants who appreciated honest customers, and Mrs. Brennan, who'd appointed herself unofficial mother of the bride. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with vows that emphasized partnership and mutual support rather than traditional promises of obedience and protection. "Do you, Samuel Hartwell, take Martha Caldwell as your partner in all things, to stand beside her through whatever challenges this territory may offer?" "I do." "And do you, Martha Caldwell, take Samuel Hartwell as your partner in all things, to build something lasting together in this new country?" "I do." The rings were simple gold bands that Samuel had commissioned from the town's blacksmith, inscribed with their initials and the date. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle but full of promise, the beginning of something neither had expected to find. The celebration that followed was typically frontier in its enthusiasm. The entire town seemed to consider the wedding an excuse for revelry, with miners buying rounds of drinks and Mrs. Brennan producing a cake that had clearly been planned well in advance. Martha found herself dancing with strangers who welcomed her as one of their own, no longer the exotic Eastern lady, but simply Samuel's wife and a new member of their community. Late that evening, as the celebration wound down, Martha and Samuel walked through the quiet streets toward their temporary home at the boarding house. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to their valley, but tonight belonged to reflection and quiet conversation. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked as they paused outside the church where they'd been married hours earlier. Martha considered the question seriously. "About leaving Boston?" "No." "About James Mitchell?" "That feels like something that happened to a different person." "About marrying you?" She smiled. "Ask me again in 20 years. "Fair enough." They were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the south, unusual for this time of night. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, slouched wearily. In his saddle, it was Jake Morrison, one of the territorial marshals who covered this part of the territory. "Evening, Sam," Morrison called out, recognizing Samuel despite the dim light. "Heard you got married. Congratulations." "News travels fast," Samuel replied. "What brings you to Silver Creek this late?" Morrison dismounted stiffly, showing the effects of hard riding. "Official business, mostly, but I've got some news that might interest you. That Apache trouble you tangled with last week? It's officially over." Samuel felt Martha tense beside him. Meaning the territorial governors declared the Apache wars finished in this district. Grey Wolf's death broke the last resistance. The remaining bands have agreed to move to the reservation peacefully. There's even talk of compensation for settlers who suffered losses during the raids. This was better news than Samuel had dared hope for. With the Apache threat officially ended, their homesteading venture would be considerably safer and more likely to attract neighbors and trade opportunities. "There's more," Morrison continued. "The Territorial Land Office is fast-tracking homestead claims in areas that were previously too dangerous to settle. Your valley's been surveyed and approved for immediate filing. Governor wants to encourage rapid settlement to strengthen territorial claims for statehood." Martha and Samuel exchanged glances. The timing was almost too good to be true, as if events were conspiring to help them succeed. "Appreciate the information, Jake," Samuel said. "You'll stay the night, if Mrs. Brennan has room. I've got more stops to make tomorrow, but I could use a few hours' sleep in a real bed." As Morrison led his horse toward the boarding house, Martha and Samuel continued their evening walk. The marshal's news had transformed their cautious optimism into genuine excitement about the future. "It seems," Martha observed, "that we've chosen our timing well." "Or our timing chose us," Samuel replied. "Sometimes I think this whole thing, your stagecoach, the Apache raid, everything, was meant to happen exactly as it did." Martha wasn't usually given to superstitious thinking, but she had to admit the sequence of events seemed remarkably fortuitous. A mail-order bride traveling to marry a dead man, an Apache raid at precisely the right moment, a cavalry scout who'd lost his leg but not his courage. The elements seemed designed to bring them together. The next morning brought a flurry of preparations for their departure. Samuel purchased supplies for their homesteading venture, while Martha arranged for equipment that would be needed to establish a proper household in the wilderness. Mrs. Brennan proved invaluable, providing advice about everything from preserving food to treating common ailments with frontier remedies. "You'll want to plant your garden on the south slope if possible," the Irish woman instructed as she packed Martha's purchases. "Gets the best sun and drains well during the spring melt. And always keep a good supply of medicinal herbs. You'll be your own doctor out there." The general store owner, a shrewd German immigrant named Otto Brenner, sold them everything from farming tools to ammunition, along with plans for a water-powered sawmill that could turn their valley's timber into profitable lumber. "Smart thinking," Brenner commented, as Samuel examined the sawmill plans. "Territory's growing fast, always need good lumber, and you'll have the trees and water power to make it work." By afternoon, they'd assembled a wagon train of sorts. Their riding horses, Samuel's pack mule, 2 oxen for heavy work, a milk cow, and enough supplies to last through the first winter. The investment had used up most of Samuel's savings and Martha's remaining money, but they were confident in their ability to make the land profitable. The departure from Silver Creek was less ceremonial than their wedding, but equally significant. Mrs. Brennan shed actual tears as she hugged Martha goodbye, extracting promises to send word of their progress and to return for visits when possible. "You're good people," the Irishwoman declared. "That valley's lucky to get you." The journey to their homestead took 2 days, through a country that grew more beautiful with each mile. Samuel's chosen valley proved to be everything he'd promised, a protected basin with good water, fertile soil, and timber for building. The view from the valley's mouth showed endless mountains stretching to the horizon, painted in shades of purple and gold by the afternoon sun. Martha stood in the meadow that would become their home, turning slowly to take in every detail. She could envision the house they'd build, the gardens she'd plant, the life they'd create together in this hidden paradise. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt truly at home. "It's perfect," she said simply. Samuel watched her face, seeing the same wonder and possibility that had drawn him to this place years earlier. "It will be, once we build it up properly. House first, then the barn, then we can think about the sawmill. How long do you think it will take to build a working ranch? Maybe 5 years? To build something we can pass on to our children? A lifetime. Children." Martha realized they'd never discussed that possibility directly, though it had been implied in their talk of building something lasting. The thought didn't frighten her, as it once might have. Out here, children would be partners in the family enterprise, rather than burdens to be managed by servants. They spent their first night in the valley sleeping under the stars, their temporary camp sheltered by a grove of aspen trees near the stream. Martha had never slept outdoors by choice, but she found the experience remarkably peaceful. The silence was profound. No city noises, no human voices, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the gentle murmur of water over stones. "Samuel," she said quietly as they lay side by side, looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. "I want you to know that I understand what we're undertaking. This won't be easy, and we'll probably make mistakes that cost us time and money. There will be setbacks and disappointments, and times when we wonder if we're crazy for trying this." Samuel waited, sensing there was more. "But I also want you to know that I've never been more certain about anything in my life. Whatever we build here, we'll build it together, and that makes all the risks worthwhile." Samuel reached for her hand in the darkness, finding it steady and warm. "I love you, Martha Hartwell." It was the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, though they'd both felt it growing between them during their shared trials. Martha squeezed his hand, understanding the significance of the moment. "I love you too, Samuel, more than I thought possible when I stepped off that stagecoach." The next morning brought the beginning of their real work. Samuel marked the boundaries of their claim, while Martha began clearing the site for their first cabin. The territorial surveyor had already established the legal boundaries, but they needed to understand every acre of their new domain. The valley was larger than it had appeared from the entrance. Nearly 2,000 acres of meadow, forest, and hillside that could support cattle, sheep, crops, and timber operations. A year-round stream provided power for mills and irrigation for agriculture. Game was plentiful, and the soil was rich enough to support serious farming. By the end of their first week, they'd established a routine that played to both their strengths. Samuel handled the heavy construction work, using skills learned during his military service to plan and execute building projects. Martha managed the domestic side of their operation, while also proving surprisingly capable with tools and carpentry. Their first cabin was modest but well built, designed to house them through the winter while they planned their permanent home. Martha insisted on windows that would provide good light for reading and handwork, while Samuel prioritized a stone chimney that would burn efficiently and safely. The work was physically demanding but emotionally satisfying in ways neither had expected. Each completed task brought visible progress toward their shared goals. When Martha successfully established her first garden, Samuel felt as proud as if he'd accomplished it himself. When Samuel completed the cabin's roof, Martha celebrated, as if she'd driven every nail personally. Evenings brought the quiet companionship they'd discovered during their flight from the Apache. They'd read aloud from books Samuel had brought from his mountain cabin, play chess by lamplight, or simply sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the western peaks. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Samuel asked one evening, as they watched deer come down to drink from their stream. Martha considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss some things about it. The libraries, mostly. And the convenience of having everything available without planning ahead. But I wouldn't go back, even if I could. Why not? Because in Boston, I was living someone else's idea of what my life should be. Here, I'm creating my own idea of what life could be. That's worth more than all the conveniences in the world." As autumn progressed toward winter, their routine expanded to include preparations for the cold months ahead. Martha learned to preserve meat and vegetables using methods Mrs. Brennan had taught her. Samuel cut and split enough firewood to last until spring, while also beginning work on furniture for their permanent home. The first snow arrived in November, transforming their valley into a wonderland of white silence. Martha had never experienced a mountain winter, but she found the beauty compensated for the isolation. Their cabin was warm and well supplied, and the enforced intimacy of winter quarters only strengthened their partnership. During the long evenings, they planned their future expansion. Samuel sketched designs for the sawmill that would provide their primary income, while Martha calculated the economics of various agricultural ventures. By spring, they'd have detailed plans for transforming their homestead into a profitable operation. Christmas came quietly, marked by small gifts they'd made for each other and a dinner that Martha prepared with supplies they'd carefully hoarded. Samuel had carved her a writing desk from mountain pine, while Martha had sewn him a warm jacket lined with fur from animals they'd trapped. "Best Christmas I've had in years," Samuel announced as they sat by their fire, watching snow fall outside. Their windows. "It's certainly different from Boston," Martha agreed, "but I prefer it this way, more personal somehow." As winter deepened, they developed the easy intimacy of people who'd chosen to share their lives completely. Martha discovered that Samuel was an excellent storyteller, with a fund of experiences from his military service and mountain life. Samuel learned that Martha had an unexpected talent for mathematics and business planning that complemented his practical skills perfectly. The physical aspect of their marriage developed naturally, without the awkwardness that might have existed between strangers. They'd already proven themselves to each other under the most challenging circumstances, and the love that grew between them was based on genuine respect and compatibility. Spring arrived with a rush of snowmelt and wildflowers that transformed their valley into a paradise of color and sound. Martha's garden, planted in carefully prepared soil, promised an excellent harvest. Samuel's sawmill, constructed during the winter months, was ready for operation as soon as the snow cleared enough to bring in logs. On a warm afternoon in May, exactly 1 year after Martha had left Boston to marry a stranger, she stood in the meadow where they'd built their permanent home, a substantial house with large windows, multiple rooms, and a wide porch that captured the morning sun. Samuel joined her, wiping sawdust from his hands after a morning spent milling lumber for their neighbors' building projects. The sawmill had proven profitable beyond their expectations, providing steady income while they developed their other enterprises. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question from their wedding night. Martha looked around at the life they'd built together, the thriving garden, the comfortable house, the business that was already attracting settlers to their valley. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the cabins of 3 other families who'd homesteaded nearby, drawn by the availability of good lumber and the promise of community. "Only that it took me 26 years to find out what I was, really meant to do with my life," she replied. Samuel pulled her close, both of them understanding how remarkable their journey had been. A mail-order bride and a broken cavalry scout had found each other by accident and created something neither could have achieved alone. As the sun set behind the mountains they now called home, Martha and Samuel Hartwell stood together on the porch of the house they'd built with their own hands, partners in every sense of the word, and knew that they'd found exactly what they'd been searching for all their lives. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, carried by a young cavalry lieutenant who'd ridden hard from Fort Collins. Martha was hanging laundry behind their house when she saw the dust cloud approaching their valley, and something in the rider's urgent pace made her call for Samuel immediately. Lieutenant David Crawford was barely 21, with the earnest face of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. He dismounted outside their front porch and approached with military precision, his eyes taking in the substantial improvements they'd made to their homestead over the past 2 years. "Mr. Hartwell, I have correspondence from the territorial capital that requires immediate attention." Samuel accepted the official envelope with growing concern. Government letters rarely brought good news to frontier settlements, and the lieutenant's formal manner suggested this wasn't a routine communication. The letter bore the seal of the territorial governor and was signed by officials Martha didn't recognize. As Samuel read it aloud, she felt the comfortable world they'd built begin to shift beneath their feet. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell," Samuel began, his voice growing tighter with each sentence. "Recent surveys conducted by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad have identified your valley as essential to the proposed northern route through the territory. The Railroad Commission, in cooperation with territorial authorities, hereby notifies you of pending eminent domain proceedings to acquire your property for railway construction." Martha sank into one of the porch chairs they'd built themselves, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "They want to take our land?" "Not just take it," Samuel continued reading. "They're offering compensation of $2 per acre for what they call undeveloped mountain terrain, despite the improvements we've made. Total compensation would be $4,000 for the entire homestead." Lieutenant Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "I'm instructed to inform you that you have 30 days to respond to this offer. If you decline, the territorial government will initiate formal eminent domain proceedings." Martha did quick calculations in her head. $4,000 was a substantial sum, but nowhere near the value of what they'd created. The sawmill alone generated more than that in annual revenue, and their land's strategic position made it invaluable for controlling access to the entire region. "What gives them the right?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Territorial law permits acquisition of private property for projects deemed essential to territorial development," Crawford replied, reciting language that sounded memorized. "The Railroad Commission has determined that this route is crucial for connecting eastern markets with mining operations in the Western Territories." Samuel studied the young officer's face, reading the discomfort there. "This isn't the first homestead you've visited with this news, is it, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. I've delivered similar notices to 14 properties along the proposed route." Crawford's professional mask slipped slightly. "Most of the others were smaller holdings, though. Nothing like what you've built here." After the lieutenant departed, Martha and Samuel sat in stunned silence on their porch, looking out at the life they'd created. The sawmill's wheel turned steadily in the stream, processing logs that would become homes for other settlers. Martha's expanded gardens showed the results of 3 growing seasons of careful cultivation. The barn sheltered livestock that represented years of careful breeding and selection. "We could fight it," Samuel said eventually. "How?" "They're offering compensation under territorial law. This isn't theft, it's legal appropriation for what they consider the greater good." Samuel's jaw tightened. The greater good. Funny how that always seems to benefit railroad companies and territorial politicians more than the people who actually live here. Martha understood his anger, but she also recognized the larger forces at work. The territory was changing rapidly, driven by pressures far beyond their control. Mining discoveries, railroad expansion, and the approaching prospect of statehood were transforming the entire region. "We need to understand what our real options are," she said practically. "Let's ride to Silver Creek tomorrow and talk to people who know territorial law better than we do." The next day's journey to Silver Creek revealed the scope of the railroad's ambitions. They passed survey crews marking the proposed route, and Martha noticed how the planned path would indeed provide the most direct connection between the territory's mining districts and the Eastern Railroad network. Mrs. Brennan greeted them with the same warmth she'd shown during their courtship, but her expression grew grave when they explained their situation. "It's been the talk of every settlement between here and Denver," she said, pouring coffee in her familiar boarding house kitchen. "Railroads got backing from investors in Chicago and New York. They're planning the biggest construction project this territory's ever seen." "What about legal challenges?" Martha asked. "Expensive and uncertain. Territorial courts tend to favor development projects, especially ones with this kind of financial backing." Mrs. Brennan's expression was sympathetic, but realistic. "I've seen this happen before, just not on this scale." They spent the afternoon consulting with Silver Creek's unofficial legal expert, a former lawyer named Thomas Whitman, who'd come west for his health and stayed for the opportunities. Whitman's assessment was blunt and discouraging. "Eminent domain. Cases are nearly impossible to win, especially when the territorial government supports the project," he explained. "Your best hope is to negotiate better compensation or find alternative property that meets your needs." "But we don't want alternative property," Martha protested. "We want our home." Whitman's expression was kindly but firm. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand your attachment to your homestead, but the railroad represents progress that benefits the entire territory. Sometimes personal interests have to yield to larger concerns." That evening, Martha and Samuel walked through Silver Creek's streets, both lost in troubled thoughts. The town had grown considerably since their wedding, with new businesses and residents arriving regularly. The changes were visible everywhere. Better roads, more substantial buildings, signs of prosperity that hadn't existed 2 years earlier. "It's not just about us, is it?" Martha said eventually. Samuel understood what she meant. The railroad would transform the entire region, bringing economic opportunities, but also ending the isolation that had attracted them to frontier life. Whether they kept their land or lost it, their way of life was about to change dramatically. "No," he agreed. "The whole territory's changing. Question is whether we change with it or get left behind." They spent 2 more days in Silver Creek, gathering information about the railroad project and its implications. What they learned was both impressive and sobering. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was planning to invest millions of dollars in construction, hire thousands of workers, and connect previously isolated communities to national markets. The economic benefits would be substantial. Mining operations that struggled with transportation costs would become profitable. Agricultural products could reach eastern markets. Manufactured goods would arrive faster and cheaper than ever before, but the social costs would be equally significant. Small communities would be overwhelmed by construction crews and the rough culture that followed railroad construction. Land values would fluctuate wildly. Traditional ways of life would be disrupted or destroyed entirely. On their final evening in Silver Creek, Martha and Samuel sat in Mrs. Brennan's parlor, discussing their options with the woman who'd become their unofficial advisor. "You could take the compensation and start over somewhere else," she suggested. $4,000 would buy a lot of land in areas the railroad isn't interested in. "We'd be running from progress," Samuel replied, "and there's no guarantee it won't catch up with us eventually. Then you could stay and adapt. The railroad will need local services, lumber, supplies, labor. Your sawmill could become more profitable than ever." Martha had been thinking along similar lines. What about the other homesteaders, the ones who received similar notices? Mixed reactions. Some are planning to take the money and leave. Others are talking about forming some kind of association to negotiate better terms. The idea of collective action intrigued Martha. Individual homesteaders had little leverage against railroad companies and territorial governments, but a group might be able to negotiate more effectively. "Who's organizing this association?" Samuel asked. "Nobody yet. But there's going to be a meeting next week at the Grange Hall in Millerville. All the affected property owners are invited." Martha and Samuel exchanged glances. They'd spent their marriage making decisions together, weighing options carefully before committing to courses of action. This decision felt more consequential than any they'd faced, with implications that would affect not just their own future, but the future of their entire region. "We'll be there," Martha said. The ride back to their valley gave them time to process what they'd learned and discuss their emerging strategy. Both had come to similar conclusions independently. Running away wasn't an option, but neither was passive acceptance of terms dictated by others. "We need to understand exactly what the railroad wants and why," Martha said, as they created the ridge that overlooked their home. "If we're going to negotiate, we need leverage." Samuel nodded, his military training asserting itself in the face of conflict. "Intelligence first, then strategy. We need to know who's really making decisions and what their constraints are." Their homestead looked particularly beautiful in the afternoon light, with autumn colors beginning to show in the aspen groves and their gardens heavy with the season's final harvest. Martha felt a fierce protectiveness toward everything they'd built, but also a growing understanding that protecting it might require changing it. That night, they made lists of everything they needed to know: who was financing the railroad, which officials were involved in decision-making, what alternative routes might be possible, and what other property owners were thinking. If they were going to fight, they needed to be smart about it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jake Morrison, the territorial marshal who'd brought them news of their wedding, rode into their yard with the easy confidence of someone who knew he'd be welcome. "Heard you folks got some unwelcome correspondence," he said, accepting Martha's offer of coffee and settling onto their porch. "Word travels fast," Samuel replied. "It does when it affects half the homesteaders in 3 counties. Morrison's expression was serious. "Mind if I ask what you're planning to do about it?" Martha studied the marshal's face, trying to read his intentions. "That depends on what our options really are. What do you know about this railroad project?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I know it's got backing from people with enough money and influence to get what they want. I also know it's going to change everything about how this territory operates." "You sound like you have concerns about it," Samuel observed. "I do. My job is keeping the peace, and railroad construction tends to disrupt that in ways that aren't always pleasant. But I also understand that progress has its own momentum, and smart people figure out how to work with it rather than against it. Martha leaned forward, sensing that Morrison had come for a specific purpose. "What aren't you telling us?" The marshal smiled at her directness. "There's going to be opposition to this project from some quarters. Not everyone thinks the railroad's good for the territory, and some of those people have considerable influence of their own." "What kind of opposition?" "The kind that could make life complicated for railroad investors and territorial officials who support them. There are cattle ranchers who don't want their grazing rights disrupted, mining companies that prefer the current transportation, arrangements and town governments that worry about losing control of their economic development." Samuel began to understand the larger political landscape. "You're saying this railroad project isn't as inevitable as they want us to think." "I'm saying that nothing in territorial politics is ever as simple as it appears on the surface." Smart people pay attention to all the forces at work, not just the loudest ones. After Morrison left, Martha and Samuel spent the afternoon walking their property, seeing it with new eyes. The railroad's interest made sense from an engineering perspective. Their valley provided the most direct route through the mountains, with manageable grades and access to water for steam engines. But that same strategic value might give them more leverage than they'd initially realized. If the railroad truly needed their land for the optimal route, they weren't just one homestead among many. They were a critical piece of the entire project. "We need to talk to the other property owners," Martha said as they stood beside their sawmill, watching the wheel turn steadily in the stream that might soon carry railroad traffic instead of lumber. "Agreed, but we also need to understand what we're really willing to fight for and what we'd be willing to accept." Martha considered this carefully. She'd grown to love their valley deeply, but she'd also learned that attachment to place was less important than the relationships and purposes that gave life meaning. If they lost their land but found a way to continue building something worthwhile together, that might be acceptable. If they were forced to abandon everything they'd worked for without any real choice in the matter, that would be something else. "Entirely, I'm willing to adapt," she said finally, "but I'm not willing to be powerless. Whatever happens, I want us to have a voice in decisions that affect our future." Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They'd spent their marriage as partners, making decisions together and taking responsibility for the consequences. That partnership had made them stronger than either could have been alone, and it would be the foundation for whatever came next. The meeting in Millerville was still a week away, but they had work to do before then. They needed to understand their legal position, evaluate their economic options, and most importantly, figure out how to turn their individual situation into collective action that could influence the railroad's plans. As the sun set behind the mountains they'd called home for 2 years, Martha and Samuel Hartwell stood together on the porch of the house they'd built with their own hands, facing an uncertain future, but certain of their commitment to face it together. The letter from the territorial capital had shattered their peaceful existence, but it had also presented them with an opportunity to influence the forces that were reshaping their world. Whether they succeeded or failed, they would do so as partners, with their eyes open and their principles intact. The Grange Hall in Millerville buzzed with nervous energy as nearly 40 homesteaders gathered on a crisp October evening. Martha had never seen so many worried faces in one room, and the conversations she overheard ranged from resigned acceptance to outright defiance. Samuel positioned himself near the back of the hall, where he could observe everyone, his military instincts still sharp after years of civilian life. The meeting's organizer was William Patterson, a cattle rancher whose spread covered 3,000 acres of prime grazing land directly in the railroad's path. Patterson was a big man with calloused hands and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of frontier living. When he called for order, the room fell silent immediately. "We all know why we're here," Patterson began without preamble. "The railroad wants our land, and they're offering compensation that doesn't come close to what we've built. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" A voice from the front row spoke up, Margaret Finley, whose family had homesteaded near Copper Creek. "What can we do? They've got the law on their side." "Maybe," Patterson replied. "But laws can be challenged, especially when they're being used to benefit private companies at the expense of citizens." Martha felt Samuel's attention sharpen beside her. This was the kind of strategic thinking they'd hoped to find, not just emotional opposition, but calculated resistance based on legal and political realities. Patterson continued, "I've been talking to lawyers in Denver and Colorado Springs. They say our best chance is to challenge the eminent domain proceedings on procedural grounds while negotiating for better compensation as a group." "How much better?" asked Tom Bradley, whose small farm would be completely destroyed by the railroad's route. "That depends on how unified we can be and how much leverage we can develop. Individual homesteaders have no power against the railroad. But if we organize properly, we might be able to force real negotiations." Martha stood up, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, introducing herself. "My husband and I have been researching this situation, and we've learned some things that might be relevant." She outlined what they'd discovered about the railroad's financing, the territorial government's motivations, and the opposition that existed among other economic interests. Several people took notes as she spoke, and she could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. "The key point," Martha concluded, "is that this project isn't as inevitable as they want us to believe. There are alternative routes, political opposition, and financial constraints that give us more leverage than we might think." An elderly German farmer named Klaus Weber raised his hand. "What are you proposing, Mrs. Hartwell?" Martha had been thinking about this moment for days, knowing that her answer could determine whether the group moved forward with organized resistance or fragmented into individual negotiations. "I'm proposing that we form a formal association to represent all affected property owners," she said. "We pool our resources to hire competent legal representation, coordinate our response to the railroad's offers, and present a unified front." In all negotiations, the room erupted in conversation as people discussed the proposal with their neighbors. Samuel could see the appeal of Martha's suggestion, but he also recognized the practical challenges. Getting 40 independent-minded homesteaders to agree on anything would be like herding cats. Patterson called for order again. "Mrs. Hartwell's suggestion has merit, but it raises questions about leadership and decision-making. Who would speak for the association? How would we make decisions? What happens if some members want to accept deals that others reject?" These were exactly the questions Martha had anticipated. "I suggest we elect a 3-person executive committee with rotating leadership. Decisions affecting the entire group require a majority vote of all members. Individual members remain free to make their own deals, but they forfeit the association's legal support if they do so." Samuel admired his wife's political instincts. She'd structured the proposal to maximize participation while maintaining enough flexibility to prevent the group from falling apart over disagreements. The debate continued for 2 hours, with heated discussions about legal strategy, financial contributions, and the risks of organized resistance. Some homesteaders worried about retaliation from territorial authorities. Others questioned whether they could afford the costs of prolonged legal battles. Finally, Patterson called for a preliminary vote on forming the association. Hands went up slowly at first, then more quickly as people saw their neighbors committing. When the count was finished, 32 of the 40 homesteaders had voted in favor. Martha found herself elected to the executive committee, along with Patterson and a sharp-eyed widow named Sarah Chen, who'd been operating a successful trading post before the railroad targeted her property. The committee's first task would be hiring legal representation and developing a coordinated response to the railroad's offers. After the meeting, Martha and Samuel walked through Millerville's quiet streets, processing what they'd accomplished and what lay ahead. The association was formed, but the real work was just beginning. "Think it will hold together?" Samuel asked. "For a while, long enough to make a difference, I hope." Martha was tired but energized by the evening's success. "The key will be showing early victories that justify people's faith in collective action." They rode home the next morning with a sense of purpose that reminded them both of their early days together. Once again, they were facing challenges that required them to work as partners, combining their different strengths to achieve goals neither could accomplish alone. The next 3 weeks brought a whirlwind of activity. The association hired Denver lawyer Jonathan Blackwood, whose reputation for taking on powerful interests had made him both respected and feared in territorial legal circles. Blackwood's initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. "The railroad's legal position is strong, but not unassailable," he explained during a meeting at the Patterson Ranch. "There are procedural requirements they haven't fully met, and questions about whether their proposed route truly represents the most efficient option for territorial development." Martha took detailed notes as Blackwood outlined their legal strategy. Challenge the eminent domain proceedings on technical grounds to buy time. Demand detailed economic impact studies that included the value of existing improvements. Force public hearings where affected property owners could present their cases. Meanwhile, Samuel worked with other committee members to document the real value of threatened properties. The railroad's appraisals had systematically undervalued improvements, treating working farms and ranches as undeveloped land. Correcting these assessments could significantly increase compensation offers. The association's first major success came when Blackwood discovered that the railroad had failed to properly notify 3 property owners about the eminent domain proceedings. The territorial court agreed to postpone all proceedings until proper notification could be completed, buying the association additional time to organize their defense. News of the delay spread quickly, and Martha noticed a change in how people talked about the railroad project. Instead of inevitable progress that had to be accepted, it was becoming a negotiable business deal where terms could be influenced by organized opposition. The railroad's response was swift and sophisticated. They hired their own team of lawyers and began a public relations campaign emphasizing the economic benefits that rail service would bring to the territory. Newspaper editorials appeared supporting the project, and territorial officials made speeches about the importance of progress and development. But the railroad also began reaching out to individual association members with improved offers, trying to break the group's solidarity. Some homesteaders wavered, tempted by compensation packages that were significantly better than the original proposals. Martha saw the danger immediately. "They're trying to divide us," she told the executive committee during an emergency meeting. "Pick off the most vulnerable members with better offers, then use those defections to demoralize the rest." Patterson agreed. "We need to respond fast before we lose too many members." Sarah Chen had a practical suggestion. "What if we negotiate as a group for improved terms for everyone? Use their willingness to pay more as proof that their original offers were inadequate." The strategy worked. When Blackwood presented the railroad with evidence that they'd offered some association members 50% more than their original compensation, he was able to argue that all property owners deserved similar treatment. The breakthrough came in late November, when territorial officials agreed to public hearings on the railroad project. For the first time, affected property owners would have the opportunity to present their cases directly to decision-makers. Martha spent weeks preparing for her testimony, working with Blackwood to develop arguments that would resonate with territorial officials. She focused on the economic value that existing homesteads brought to the territory, the precedent that inadequate compensation would set for future development projects, and the importance of treating property owners fairly. The hearing was held in the territorial capital on a snowy December morning. Martha had never been in such an imposing government building, with its marble floors and formal portraits of territorial governors. But she'd learned that impressive settings were often designed to intimidate, and she refused to be cowed by architectural grandeur. When her turn came to testify, Martha stood before the 5-member Territorial Commission with the same composure she'd shown facing Apache warriors. She presented detailed documentation of property values, outlined the association's legal challenges, and made a compelling case for treating homesteaders as partners in territorial development rather than obstacles to progress. Members of the Commission, she concluded, we're not opposed to progress or development that benefits the territory. We're asking for fair treatment and adequate compensation that recognizes the value of what we've built. We came to this territory as pioneers, and we've helped make it the kind of place that attracts railroad investment. We deserve to share in the prosperity that our work has helped create. The Commission asked pointed questions about alternative routes, financial impacts, and legal precedents. Martha answered each one with facts and figures she'd spent months researching, demonstrating that the association's position was based on careful analysis rather than emotional opposition. Samuel watched from the gallery with pride and admiration. The woman testifying bore little resemblance to the frightened mail-order bride he'd rescued from Apache raiders 3 years earlier. Martha had evolved into a formidable advocate who could hold her own in any setting. The Commission's decision came 2 weeks later. While they upheld the railroad's right to acquire property through eminent domain, they also established new standards for compensation that included full value for improvements and relocation assistance for displaced families. More importantly, they required the railroad to consider alternative routes that would minimize disruption to established homesteads. The association's technical challenges had raised enough questions about the proposed path to force genuine engineering review. Martha was reading the Commission's decision aloud in their kitchen when Samuel realized what they'd accomplished. Not only had they secured better compensation for association members, they'd also established legal precedents that would protect future homesteaders facing similar challenges. "We did it," he said, hardly believing it himself. "We all did it," Martha corrected. "Every member of the association, everyone who refused to be intimidated or divided." The final resolution came in March, when the railroad announced that an engineering review had identified a route that bypassed most homesteads while still providing efficient mountain access. The new path would require acquiring only 12 properties instead of 40, and the railroad agreed to pay compensation based on the Commission's enhanced standards. Martha and Samuel's homestead was among those that would be spared. The railroad would build a spur line that connected to their sawmill, actually improving their business prospects rather than destroying them. But the victory felt less important than the process that had achieved it. Martha had discovered capabilities she'd never known she possessed, while Samuel had found ways to contribute his military experience to civilian challenges. Most importantly, they'd learned that individual strength could be multiplied through collective action and mutual support. As spring returned to their valley, Martha and Samuel walked through gardens they'd planted and tended for 4 growing seasons. The railroad construction was visible in the distance, but it no longer threatened their way of life. Instead, it represented opportunities for expanded trade and connection to markets that could make their enterprises more profitable. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked, echoing the question that had become their traditional way of marking major transitions. Martha considered everything that had brought them to this moment: a desperate mail-order bride arrangement, Apache raids, frontier homesteading, and political battles with powerful interests. None of it had been what she'd planned when she'd left Boston, but all of it had contributed to a life more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. "Only that it took me so long to discover what I was capable of," she replied. "But I suppose some lessons can only be learned through experience." Samuel pulled her close, both of them understanding how far they'd traveled from that desperate morning when Apache war cries had split the dawn air. They'd found each other through circumstance, but they'd chosen to build something lasting through partnership, mutual respect, and shared commitment to principles larger than individual comfort. The railroad that had threatened to destroy their life together had instead provided the opportunity to strengthen it further. They'd faced the challenge as partners, just as they'd faced everything else, and emerged more confident in their ability to handle whatever the future might bring. As the sun set behind the mountains they'd called home for 4 years, Martha and Samuel Hartwell stood together on the porch of the house they'd built with their own hands, partners in every sense of the word, knowing that they'd not only survived the forces that had tried to tear them apart, but had grown stronger because of them. Their love story had begun with danger and desperation, but it had evolved into something deeper and more lasting. A partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that the greatest achievements come from facing life's challenges together rather than alone. The frontier was changing around them, but they were changing with it, adapting and growing while maintaining the principles that had brought them together. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, as partners, with their eyes open and their commitment to each other unshakable. In the distance, the railroad's whistle echoed through the mountains, no longer a sound of threat, but a reminder that they lived in a world of constant change and endless possibility. They had learned to navigate that world together, and that knowledge would serve them well in all the adventures that lay ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.